start our discussion of bindings, I want to kind of take a low-hanging fruit, and that is to look at the picker controls that we've worked with previously and talk about how we can bind their values to things. So I've copied the picker controls that we wrote previously to a new file called picker bindings. And we can edit that to make sure that you remember what that does. We'll go ahead and run it. And this was the program that has a date selection, and we can select dates, and it changes the text field, as well as a color chooser, which changes the background color. And so to do this previously, we added code that set the on action of the date and the color. What I want to do is I want to change these so instead of working with on action, they use bindings instead. Because it turns out that these values that we want to set are properties. As we saw we saw for a text field that the text was a property. It turns out the same is true for a label. Its text is a property. And the fill on the background is also a property. So we can make these same things happen using bindings instead. So instead of having the on action on our color picker, the syntax for this is you take the value that you want bound, and you saw those interesting operators in the API. This one here, which is a less than followed by 2 equals, is a one-way binding, and it kind of looks like an arrow pointing to the left, and that's exactly what it does. It's going to take whatever property I put over here on the right and make it so that every time that it changes, it updates the property that's on the left. I want this so that it takes our color picker, or actually we just called it color, and binds the value of color to the fill. If we run this, our goal is we should have the exact same behavior we had before. It changes the fill when we make selections, just like it did before, but we're not setting the on action, we're letting the binding do the work for us. What about for setting the date? Well, actually, how about I just delete that? I want to take the label's text and I want to bind it here. Now, it's tempting to say that I should just be able to do something like that. We can test that. Unfortunately, that's not quite sufficient. We have a number of problems with this. One of the big ones is that when you take a string and you do plus on that string, you get back another string, kind of regardless of what this is over here. Because the first thing is a string, we get back a string, and the binding needs to happen between properties here. So we need to make it so that this string isn't just a simple string, it is a string property. It turns out that's not too hard for us to do. We can simply wrap it inside of a string property. In order to make that happy, we're going to do an import ScalaFX.beans.property.string property. So that gets us a little bit closer, but it's not going to do quite what we want. You can see here that when I click stuff, I get a very different message than what I wanted. Yes, the date is over there, but it took this string property and converted the whole thing to a string, which isn't what I want. And that's because this value is not a string property, it's an object property for a date. In order to make this behave the way I want, I call as string. Now, calling toString would give us back that long string, and basically, once again, that's not what we want. The as string can be used on to kind of make as other types of properties. And you can't do this just to anything. Not every conversion makes sense. But when we have that conversion there, you can see that this now does exactly what we had been doing before, setting the label to the text for the date that we select. But once again, we're not doing it with an onAction. We are doing it with the bindings so that it happens automatically for us. It's a little bit less code. And definitely if you start making things that are complex, the bindings simplify it, and they can make it, once you get used to it, make it much easier to read the code, because once you're used to reading this, it just says, oh, fill is always going to be set to the color's value. And so that's fairly straightforward, whereas having the onAction, you have to think a bit more about what it is that's actually going on in that code.